Have Jerry Gidel back to comment on the Friday's market close on corn and soybeans, and yet a new forecast of the USDA about the US agricultural exports right here on Connected Farmer, your channel to keep you up to date with the latest trends in agriculture and livestock. Stay tuned and don't forget subscribe. So Jerry, how are you today? It seems today soybeans were hurt in the market.
Well, it's been a choppy week for all the prices. We've been up and down a little bit here. The weather situation in the U.S., where it rains, where it doesn't rain. Actually, the this time of year, we're getting pretty late for a big impact on the corn yield situation, particularly west of the Mississippi, where we've had a lot of heat and the maturity is moving along at a very fast pace. But soybeans have this amazing ability to kind of hang tough and wait for some rains. And there has been some rains around. Particularly today's impact was the fact that we had a very impressive amount of moisture that hit in the top two counties of Iowa and then southern parts of Minnesota, where there's 3 to 5 inches there from the north central to the northeast part of Iowa and southern areas of Minnesota, and that's definitely going to potentially help some of those areas that have been particularly on the dry side here this summer from that standpoint. This week's exports also kind of a mixed bag. We had a very good set of exports on soybeans, but not so good on corn. It was all right, but it wasn't enough to stir a lot of blood yesterday.
Yes, and how are you seeing the corn side of things? Because there was a smaller decline in corn prices compared to beans.
Well, the corn numbers that we've had cumulative to this point in the season here is pretty well winding down for the old crop. We only got a week and a half left to go there. But the whole focus over the last 3 or 4 weeks has been where are we at on new crop exports to this date. And that's always interesting. How much has been purchased by the world buyers here ahead of our harvest time here in the fall. And this year, particularly, we've had a couple big batches of Chinese interest in the U.S. corn from the standpoint their own internal issues back in the wintertime and then this last spring. They were also pretty aggressive, particularly because of the fact that they were looking at the South American output situation. The second crop corn is where the substantial amount of the Brazilian corn comes from here for the world export trade. And at this point, the USDA has got a number down here at I think 83 or 84 million. From there, that's down from they had a number at one time of 102 from there, and so it's a situation where, and there's even talk that it might even slide down below 80 million here before it's all said and done. And so that prompted the Chinese to make another batch of buying from the US for this fall, because in reality, they would be a big buyer of the South American Brazilian crop. And it turns up that they kind of realized that it wasn't going to be available. And actually, one of the signs we've seen so far out of Brazil, they hardly have moved any kind of corn at this point. They're really trying to figure out how much they really have and who's going to use it and things like that. There's even talk of importing corn from Argentina and some of the southern provinces and that. And so, wow, that's a big difference. So that's created actually the largest amount of corn sales that I can see here in my records all the way back, even both the last time we were over 700 million was back in 2000, it should be 1995, 1996. Which was really another amazingly tough drought year here in the U.S., where we ended up having a very small crop. Now, I can't say that the U.S. crop has been hurt. I don't know if it's extremely as small as the type situation we had back then. But in reality, with the demand we've built up here around the world, it's become quite important. And that's the reason why it's quite interesting here is to, even if we had a number here that stayed around this 175 or a little less, that would still end up being a pretty tight situation. The on the corn side, or excuse me, on this corn number, I guess it's really puts the onus on the world buyers here around the world to be looking at U.S. supplies. There's other areas of the world that have been dinged up a little bit, particularly, of course, Canada. There's not a lot of corn raised in the prairie states where the drought has been at, but there's been other areas of Europe and even parts of the Russian corn crop, which is modestly comparison to the wheat. But I think the interesting thing is that the wheat side of this thing is now the prices for wheat on a worldwide basis have really skyrocketed here in that. And so all of a sudden there's not going to be people feeding too much wheat. So that also puts more burden on the corn and feed grain output, which is even in Canada, oats and barley got dinged up because of the weather up that direction. So that's really going to make things quite interesting here. And the early results here of the corn harvest in the U.S. will be watched very, very closely.
Yes, and the USDA has just released an export forecast for the U.S. farm products, and they are saying that in next year the country will export $39 billion in agricultural products, and that's a lot more than the previous record in 2014 that was $25.7 billion.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and that's the interesting twist on this thing is that um, up until now, some people are looking at those data for the first 6 months and is, oh wow, we're not going to make the USDA or make that number or even get close to the export ideas that we're going to end up having for China. And boy, with that record level of China's purchases along with our overall purchases, as I said, up over 700 million, 700 million bushels, and that suggests that that we're going to also have some strong demand for corn for the coming year. We've had a record levels of export this year. It's not maybe as high as some people thought earlier, but it's still going to be good. And the prospects here, particularly if there's any kind of strain again on South American output going into the 2022 year, going to make things quite interesting in that area. The other twist to this thing, of course, to make that big number is the soybean side of the U.S. sales at this point. They're not as strong as last year. We had the record level over 800 million bushels already in the books at this time. I think we're around 500 and what did I say here? 575 million from there at this point. But the Chinese have been kind of interesting. They've been around every day or every other day, always buying something. They hadn't really bought, they bought beans, but they haven't bought beans in the same kind of level and that. And I think that like everybody else with this talk about La Nina starting to potentially be a factor again in the Pacific Ocean and its impact on Argentina, southern Brazil type prospects. Last year, that situation kept the plantings in Mato Grosso delayed. Normally, they like to get out there and start planting beans in the middle of September, and that when they officially come off of their length of time between the old crop beans being out and the new crop coming in. That's really there to prevent rust resurfacing in their crop down there. It's a very damaging situation in South America. So they've kind of mandated the fact that there's not a lot of double crop beans down there. That's why the corn has become such a popular item down there for a second crop. And so in that world, you put those two together, we've got a hefty amount of exports still likely to be moving out of here. And that it's going to be a little interesting where you've got the competition. In the past, the Chinese have been importing some corn from South America and importing beans from the U.S. And our capacity on shipping is kind of works. But now if you got corn and beans both going to China because there isn't the supplies in Brazil, that could make things interesting. And one of the comments that came out here the last day or two was that the domestic basis levels have picked up because of the recent or the switch of direction of the hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico that potentially was going to go into Texas. Now it looks like it could be headed for New Orleans and the Mississippi River. That's not what those exporters need right now, is to worry about getting supplies down there, getting it loaded, this kind of stuff, and being prepared for a new season. They do not need to have some machinery issues or stuff like that that's been damaged by a hurricane. So that's another issue that's popped up in here that's going to make things another factor as we go forward here in the U.S. as to how our exports, because boy, you can't really expect the U.S. to be as over like our capacity, and traditionally at the maximum is about 120 to 130 million bushels on a weekly basis, combining all the different ports and locations in that. That would make things even more interesting for the U.S. Exporting firms out here to try to make their deadlines for all the shipments that they think they really want to get out the door here.
Well, but what about the Brazilian exports? What about if Brazil has a very significant crop next year, unlike this year?
Well, that's the thing, that there's lots of optimism right now that things for the 2022 Brazilian crop. Right now, there's lots of talk of or expectations that soybean plantings are going to make another move up. And even the USDA is running 145, 147 million metric tons, up from the 137 we had this year. And everyone's kind of anticipating that the corn output will not be the same disastrous situation that it was this year in Brazil. But that factor on the corn is really way out in July, August of next year. So it's quite a ways away. And so everybody's got to get between now and next spring before they can have the supplies that they've kind of get used to utilizing and that. And with China at this point, there's a twist there in the fact that we've had more reports about the pork output for 2022 being reduced because of the African swine fever that hit some of these pork operations there in in China this year. And so it's kind of twist. The things interesting about African swine fever, it doesn't end up tainting the meat in the time that it's impacting the animal, but at the same time, to eliminate the disease, they have to eliminate the sows and the pigs and things like that, and so that's interestingly enough, the repercussions of it sometimes in the pork output is going to be the next year or 6 to 8, 9 months away because of the time you put gestation and 5 months of things. You're talking about 8 to 9 months, even at the best, before you can redo things. So, and get the output back going. So that's a factor, and that's also a factor in how much corn and protein that China's going to need in 2022. So those are some of the factors that keep these markets thinking about things as we go forward. And that, in reality, the price potential right now for 2022 has probably been somewhat limited. But I think there's some seasonal situations and needs in that. Between now and December, there's still going to be lots of concerns going on around the world about getting the South America crop in and how much yields we're going to have in the U.S. And so between now and December, there's still some price possibilities, the upside. But I'd have to encourage people to keep in mind that 2022 is probably not going to be as exciting a year as the 2021 year was here in the U.S.
Yes, and Jerry, what's on your checklist for next week?
Well, next week is going into another holiday and we'll be getting some of the trade estimates by the end of next week as to what they think about the September 10th crop report. Right now, I suspect that there's an attitude that the crop numbers on yield are going to edge up a little bit, partly because of the pro-farmer stuff and partly because of the rain activity just described here in the U.S. That'll be probably the big feature people will be watching and trying to come up with at this point. At the same time, I think the world will also be keeping a very close eye on how the pre-planting periods in Argentina and in Brazil are doing at the same time. If we have any indications that the planting season for South America is going to be delayed again, that's really going to keep people's attention after this last year when it really had a significant impact on the world's prices.
And also, you have the jobs report that is going to impact the economy and a future Fed decision.
Oh yeah, the Fed situation. There are some indications that people are trying to figure out when is the Federal Reserve going to make an impact on worrying about inflation and maybe things of this nature. But there was some indications here from a speech from Mr. Powell about the fact that the term is tapering is floating around in the financial world is basically not putting as much dollars out there in the economy to keep it floating along. And they'll be watching, like you say, the jobless rates will be and how that's going. Actually, the twist of this thing is that this last 6 or 8 weeks of expanding COVID-19 issues in the U.S. because of the Delta variant, I think is maybe postpone some of the ideas of the Federal Reserve here in the U.S. Maybe changing their policy a little bit. Maybe they're going to keep postponing that a little bit further at this point. But he did suggest in his speech today that there's still ideas of maybe ended up trying to shoot towards less money going into the economy by the end of the year, and maybe even I don't think there's any ideas of increasing interest rates in the December January period, but it's something on the agenda further out. But right now, the U.S. is still struggling back and forth here, despite the fact we've had a lot of vaccines that we need to get more of them into the people that haven't got a shot in their arm.
All right. That was a great conversation. Thank you, Jerry.
Well, and it's always good to talk with you, Luis, on an ongoing basis, and we'll talk again before the holiday.
Yep.